Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another edition of In Literacy and Numeracy News. And this is brought to you by VRJ Education Consultants. My name is Dr. Veronica Reed Johnson. And at VRJ Education Consultants, we offer one-on-one thesis coaching. We offer research support, learning assessments, educational resource design, personalized tutoring, and we also offer seminars and workshops. So we are continuing this week to talk about the Patterson Report on Jamaican students' performance in the 21st century. Now, last week, we had talked about the students' performance in the grade 4 literacy tests, literacy and numeracy tests. So let us just give a brief recap before we move on. The findings of this report is that the exam performance of Jamaican students is well below national expectations and international standards. So in this policy report, they looked at performance from 2002 up to about 2020, 2019, because we didn't have a lot of these major exams in 2020, or not in their original forms. And so they looked at 7 major tests. The GSAT, which is no longer being offered, the GNAT, which was canceled, CSEC, CAPE, PEP, which came in 2018, 2019, and the grade 4 literacy and numeracy tests. So last week we talked about the literacy and numeracy tests, so you can check that video to see how our discussion. Today we are going into the GSAT exams. So for those who are not familiar, the GSAT exams came in 1999. It replaced the common entrance exam. So that's the exam I went to high school long before 1999. So the GSAT itself has been replaced, but the GSAT was running from 1999 up to about 2018. In GSAT, 5 subjects are covered: math, science, language, social studies, and composition. The students get different scores for different subjects given the weighting. So math, language, and social studies are given the same weighting. Science has a lower weighting, as well as composition. But that was changed in 2015, 2016, where all of them except composition so 4 subjects were weighted at 100. And you had weightings across the board. And then GSAT was replaced by PEP in the 2018-2019 academic year. We are going to talk about PEP in another video. So let's see the results from GSAT. So what was seen over from 2001 to 2018, almost 20 years that GSAT is running, was that there's a significant improvement in the scores. Right? So they started in 2001. There was a little bit of a cratering of the scores in 2014, in 2004, sorry, and then we saw things getting worked out and we had an improvement, all right? Another thing to look at, as we had done last week, is to look at the differences in gender. Again, in GSAT, which is consistent with what we saw with the grade 4 performance. So they have the grade 4 test, and then GSAT was done in grade 6. So it is unsurprising that the girls were outperforming the boys in grade 4, and they would have continued to outperform them in grade 6. So over the entire history of the GSAT, girls outperform boys. But as we can see in the diagram, this has been narrowing, which again is similar to the results that we got in terms of, we discussed last week from the grade 4 test. So let's look at different subjects, because we do see different performance by gender for different subjects. So if we look on the left of the screen, on the left of my screen, when we're looking at the math scores, we will see the females outperforming the males. And again, in the language scores, we're also seeing the females outperforming the males. But again, we're seeing language scores here are going up to almost 70%. The math scores are lower, going up to almost 60%. Rather than looking at just mean scores, it is important to look at the different proficiencies. So what has happened with GSAT and has continued to into PEP, we will discuss, is that students are sorted into different groups. So for GSAT, there were 4 groups: non-proficient, sub-proficient, proficient, and highly proficient, okay? And so educators prefer to sort the students by these groups rather than just by mean scores. So highly proficient or proficient, sometimes we'll say mastery. So you have those terms being used as well. So let's look at the overall performance in terms of GSAT, and it shows you the differences in terms of the proficiency categories. The proficient group remains at the same level. So our proficient group is in gray. And we're seeing that the proficient groups remain at roughly the same level between 2001 to 2018, sorry. But if we look at the highly proficient group in yellow, we're seeing a significant increase. So we started at 25%, went down to about 10%. As students master the exam and the teachers as well. And then we see that going up to 37%. So we are seeing over this time, more students getting into that category of highly proficient. More good news is that the category of non-proficient, which is in blue on the diagram, we see that going down. Right? But towards the end, we started with roughly 5% students being non-proficient, and we ended with roughly 5% students being non-proficient. But we can see in terms of orange, the students that were sub-proficient, we started at 30% and we ended close to 20%. So this overall indicates that more students are getting into those categories of proficient and highly proficient in their different subjects. So what we are doing here is to collapse the groups from 4 proficiencies into 2. So non-proficient and sub-proficient are put into one category. Proficient and highly proficient, which means students know what they're doing, we put them into one group. So here we're seeing the divergence I just discussed, where more students are proficient on this test over time, on the orange line on the diagram, and fewer students are in the non-proficient category. We see that going down over time, which is the blue line. So overall in the GSAT, if we look up again at gender, we are seeing that the gap is closing, where it started at about 30%, or we had a 7-point gap and we moved to a 12-point gap. 12% gap, yeah, 12-point gap. So you're seeing where in terms of males and females, the gender gap is actually closing. Consistent with our discussion last week, overall in terms of grade 4 proficiency, right? Looking at the different regions, so we pick out some different regions. They have some regions here: Kingston, Brownstown, Mandeville, Port Antonio, Montego Bay, Old Harbor. And we're seeing different levels of proficiency. So we see Kingston at the top, the blue line, the top line that you're seeing is Kingston, showing the most improvement and consistent improvement. Montego Bay was overtaken by Mandeville, and throughout the entire period, Port Antonio was the poorest performer. But overall, we are seeing improvements in performance on the GSAT by region over the time. So we are seeing consistency as would be expected in terms of the performance of the students in their grade 4 proficiency. And GSAT is basically a grade 6 proficiency, right? So we are seeing where we had improving performance in terms of grade 4 proficiency, improving performance in terms of their GSAT, their grade 6 achievement test. And we see where there's a gender gap between males and females, with the females outperforming the males. And in this case, they also looked at the regions and seeing that some regions are outperforming the regions, other regions, but overall, we are seeing improvements in terms of what is available or what is happening over this time between 2000 and 2018 in terms of the performance of the students. So that is it for today in terms of our discussion of the results of GSAT, what was happening over this period in terms of the performance of these students. So next week, we are going to go into GNAT, we're going to go into PEP, we're going to see what the results are. After we've spoken about all of the different tests, then we will get into, well, what are the puzzles that they're talking about? What are the problems that they're talking about? What are the major items that came out of this report? Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next week.